Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of It Depends. I'm your co-host, Elias Khnaser, and I am joined today with Sanjeev Mohan, Anna Bellick, and Nick Hudecker. And today we have a super interesting and typically, as usual, super controversial topic, which is observability. So welcome, everyone, and I'm just going to kick it off. I'm just going to start by saying, am I the only one, by the way, that's noticing that everything that we're doing in tech today is confusing, elusive, requires a lot of definition? I mean, look at hybrid cloud and edge and cloud in general. Is it just me?
Yeah.
It is just you, yeah.
Yeah, it's just you. It's crystal clear to the rest of us.
Yeah, we're all on the same page.
Well, so that I'm glad. I'm glad everybody's not as confused as I am. But so let's start with observability then. I'm not really sure what observability is. Is it something new? Is it a thing? Is it just an umbrella for a bunch of things? Because when you think of observability, people will say, well, it's all metrics, all monitoring, all traceability, all logging. And I'm like, okay, so is it just an umbrella term?
No, it's so where observability comes from is from industrial control theory, right? It's not new. It's new to IT, but it's been used in industrial applications for a long time. And basically it means, can I infer the internal state of this piece of equipment or this piece of software from the signals that it emits, right? What's going on under the hood? And this is, it's gotten more press. It's gotten a lot of hype lately because things are really complicated, right? The world's a messy place. If I'm rolling out a new application, it might be comprised of dozens or perhaps hundreds of different like microservices. Each one of those likely has its own technology stack of a dozen or more different components. And so trying to think of, all right, well, I'm going to set up all my monitoring solutions so that they'll send everything to me and my lights will go from green to yellow to red and I'll know what to look for. Those days are gone, right? Now it's very much, I'm deploying into Kubernetes containers. They might only last 24 hours. And so by the time I realize there's a problem, the data is gone. So observability is basically this idea of, I don't know what's going on yet. Let me go explore the data and figure it out. Once I figure out what new thing I want to keep track of, I'll add that to my monitoring systems.
But Nick, is it a tool? Like, am I going to look at something?
No, it's a concept.
Am I going to manually?
Like anything else, it's a concept, right?
Okay.
So you might buy Splunk, you might buy Elastic, you might buy New Relic, and all of those things. Those vendors are all trying to sell observability. And full disclosure, I work for an observability company as well. But it's really going to be more of a mindset or a practice that you will say, all right, I'm going to, for this new application, I'm going to build it out with a lot of instrumentation. Maybe I'm using OpenTelemetry for that. That's another topic for another day. And then that's going to send all of this additional data into these systems, and I'll have a more exploratory environment to see what's changing over time. It's that exploratory environment that is really falling short today. When it comes to more of the traditional vendor story, it is very much, observability looks a lot like monitoring, right? So it's like old wine in new bottles when it comes to that part of the conversation. For kind of newer companies in the space, like a Lightstep, a Honeycomb, I'd argue Cribble, right? We take a pretty different view of observability data. We are working on those types of solving those kinds of problems. So I'll stop there. Does that make sense? Is that starting to go in the right direction?
It does. I kind of want to actually back up a little bit because Nick's making a fantastic point here that may not be super clear to somebody who's not an expert in the space. And it's that the quantity of data that we're able to collect is just exponentially growing every year, right? And we say this a lot, but it's true, especially in observability, because there is like this notion of you just want to know if that system is performing like it's supposed to, like, is it failing, for example, right? And there are very simple scenarios, like our pipes froze last year. So we bought a temperature sensor and we stuck it next to that place in our house. And now I have a way to see what the temperature is of that space all the time. And if it ever drops below some minimum number, I go and like turn the space heater on, right? Like that's an observability problem that I've solved. But the problem is when you're dealing with like microservices or any other complex environment, there isn't like one thing that you can look at and say, oh, if this number is too small or too large, then the thing is broken. There are like thousands of things that you have to reason about in very complex ways to determine whether the system is actually performing in the correct way.
So I have a bunch of questions for both of you, but before I do that, Sanjeev,
Yeah.
is this your perspective observability as well, or do you have a different take on it?
So the way Nick and Anna have defined is the right definition. It's just observing the state and the flow of all the assets that are flowing through this IT environment. The way I look at it is that the observability is pretty well defined, pretty well known, thanks to companies like Datadogs, New Relic, Splunk. They've been doing it for a long time. So people get confused between the observabilities that I cover, which is data observability, versus observable data, which is what Nick's company covers. And so I want to take a step back and say that we need to think of observability under different pillars. For example, one is operations or infrastructure and operations. That's your space. That includes all the logs being generated from firewalls, from operating systems, from hardware, and all of that. That is where some of these companies are mentioned. They have a big role to play. But then there's observability for applications. That is what we have called APM, or application performance management tools. Then there's observability for even business KPIs. There are companies like Anodot. There's one called Sisu. There are a bunch of companies in this space that do. Outlier is another one. But data observability is a new space. Under data observability, we are looking for data quality metrics. We're looking for how the pipeline is behaving. If something breaks, how quickly can I go back and see, was it a data drift issue, or was it that a job did not run in middle of the night? Or even is it the infrastructure? Is it that the Spark job that I kicked off, the Spark job consumed too much memory, and so there was a failure. So data observability is a combination of data quality, data pipeline, and the infrastructure it runs on. So that is the space that I cover.
Okay.
I'm going to make fun of you and say, Nick and I are really glad you finally caught up, because I think it's the same thing. I think you're describing the same thing.
Shots fired.
Right? But honestly, observability at high level is just about the health of a system, right? Mm-hmm. So what you're talking about are different kinds of systems, right? A business is a system, right? An environment, like in Linux environment, is a system. My backyard is also a system, right? So you can actually observe the performance or behavior of any system, and what you need are just different metrics, right? And different analytics ultimately to sit on top of those metrics.
Well, so let me fire a different, because you guys have been talking and I've got like a million questions now. So let me see if I can, again, from an INO as an infrastructure operations engineer, let me fire a few questions. So a few years ago, all the hype was about APM, and Sanjeev mentioned that. I'm glad he did. So I understand that data is everywhere because infrastructure is everywhere, because our applications are everywhere, because security is everywhere. All of that's great. We're producing more data, great. Who's doing the correlation? So is observability about correlating all of these data and somehow generating actionable metrics? Like, how is it going to come together? Give me a day in the world of an INO person that wants to use observability. What does that look like? What do they do?
Well, it's an interesting question because it's an unanswered question.
It depends.
Right. It depends.
There you go.
Like the tools. So let's say I'm collecting all of this data, right? APM is a really good place to start. Okay, I've got my agent, right, running on my application, and a lot of companies are still on-prem. They might have hundreds of thousands of agents running across their infrastructure. And it's kind of a nightmare because you've got that one agent that's sending data to that one platform, right? And so, and this is frankly where the company I'm coming from is trying to solve this problem, right? So you've got agent, platform, big data silo, and that happens time and again. And so it's really difficult for you to get, let's say true observability, because you're kind of locked into this agent to platform one-to-one communication. So as far as like, I'm going to take all of this data, I'm going to put it into an observability lake, and then I'm going to explore the data, right? Let's call it something. And I know it's a ridiculous term, but
Gonna
let's call it
drown
something.
in it is what you're going to do. You're going to drown in the observability lake.
Yeah, you're going to drown in it. But there aren't tools to do that correlation, right? To search across lots of different repositories of data or bring all of that stuff together. So if you look at like Google Trends data right now, number one thing that comes up, what is observability? As far as how to do it, well, good luck. I mean, it's a pretty big challenge. And frankly, I think the challenge starts with data, right? That's the number one issue. If I can't get all the data from all these different agents or collect all these log files or pull everything from all these firewalls, first off, doing that because the volumes are immense, right? We talk to companies every day. They're dealing with 40 terabytes of data coming in from CloudTrail. There are 200 terabytes coming in from their own internal networks. So the data volumes are immense. And then having some kind of uniform way to deal with all that, we're ways out from that today.
So I want to push back on you a little bit, actually, on the it all starts with data thing, because I would argue that it all starts with use cases, right? Like you can have all the data in the world, and if it's not relevant to what you're actually trying to look at, it doesn't help. It's just a waste of storage, frankly, right?
Right.
Thanks
for setting me up, because that's exactly what we do.
You don't know what's relevant. See, the problem.
That's the problem. We often just don't know.
Yes.
Well, I mean, the value of data is zero until it isn't. Right?
Exactly.
Like you might save all this stuff, and you have the best intentions in the world. You're going to put this into your high dollar analytics platform, but it may not be useful at all. And in the meantime, you've already paid to store that data, right? Whether you've got ingest or workload based pricing, you're paying in some way, and it's also slowing down performance of that system because it's indexed and it may never be used. So there's a lot of challenges. You know, I don't think use cases from an observability perspective are as much of a driver as having the opportunity to figure out what those use cases are. My background as a data person, if I were to think about observability versus monitoring, I would say that observability is more like a data lake. I don't know what I don't know yet, but I need an opportunity to figure that out. Monitoring is much more like a data warehouse, which is I know the questions I want to ask. I know the things I want to monitor. Let me optimize for that.
There's kind of a good analog in security, right? Because actually this comes up a lot. Like when we talk about collecting logs, essentially, or collecting any kind of security data, we ask the question of like, should we collect that? Should we collect all of it and then hope we need it? Or should we only collect what we need to answer the question? Because if we collect all of it, we get a lot of noise, right? And if you ask somebody who's looking at a dashboard that's throwing alerts, they'll say, don't send me any more noise. I have enough noise, right? But if you ask somebody who's doing forensic analysis or incident response, they want all the data because they don't know what they're looking for. They're just like, I need everything I can pull on because I can't find I don't know what I'm looking for, right? So there's not really like an answer of you do this or you do that. You kind of have to do both, and you have to like turn that dial up or down based on the scenario that you're in.
And a lot of the conversation, like in last year, was observability and developers, right? Developers are going to accrue the most benefit for observability practices. Developers don't care. Like they just don't, right? Like this whole idea of like, oh, we're going to shift left and we're going to have biz dev SecOps. What the hell is that?
I mean, you can make them care by just forcing KPIs on them that cause them to care.
Right. But they're not doing their core thing, which is shipping product as fast as possible.
Well, I hope so. I hope they are.
I think,
well, I hope they're shipping better product.
That's the ideal. But I think because like the security issue is key for us, because I think most of the observability benefits will actually accrue to security and operations folks, right? Because they do need to do both.
So where does AI play?
I see engineering folks benefiting the most from data observability, especially because monitoring is basically looking at the logs and visualizing, showing trends and doing all of that. Observability is going a level deeper. It's trying to understand why did something break and or trying to even predict it. It's like, we expect certain amount of data to come in to our infrastructure every day at a certain amount of time from a certain region. And this time it did not. So why did it not? Maybe, a job failed. So basically predicting and then trying to alert people and saying that we think there is a failure. So that's why I think you need both observability and monitoring.
No, this isn't an either or. It's definitely an and. Right?
Yeah, I don't think anyone
to Anna's point earlier, you have to do both.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
So where does AI play in all of this? Because it just feels to me, again, I'm sitting here trying to analyze all of this. It feels like a heck of a lot of work to set all of this up. And I've got a follow-up question, but does AI have any role to play here to, first of all, expose these insights? Because it's going to be impossible for a human to see these, right? So how do we expose these? Like that Sanjeev's earlier point, how am I going to know that the data didn't come in and that there's a problem? Like, what does that look like?
So, the observability lake that you're drowning in? AI is the rock around your feet. Like you're just going down faster.
Well, so my point though is I
only
want
half
to make sure
trolling.
that our listeners can take something actionable. Like we've been talking a lot about observability. Okay, I'm starting to get a sense for it, right? But I want a sense for, all right, I want to do this. Where do I start? What do I do? What is something tangible? Like how do I put it together? Or how do I, like baby steps even? What's my foundation? Like where do I start?
So first of all, I have to say there are 4 windows open here. Eli, you're asking the questions. The 3 of us who are like debating these topics, we're talking about, I think, different things. When Nick is talking about observability, he's focused on massive volumes of data sitting in this observability data lake. So your question about how does AI help, and Anna's response is more focused on the data lake piece. I'm talking about data as it's flowing in real time and using AI at that point in time and making a determination of whether to quarantine it or to let it go through. So we, and I'm at there's an infrastructure layer. Which is where the massive volumes of data is coming through. There is a data layer, the application layer, the business layer. So I'm talking about the data layer here. And so to answer your question is like, how should our viewers think about observability? The first thing is, what is your persona? And what area do you need to observe? Some of you viewers are from the INO or the infrastructure and operations space, so you're already familiar with Splunks of the world, and now you have to look at Cribble and Honeycomb and all of these new ones and figure out what is different. But if you're from the data world or the application world, it's a different conversation and a different set of tools. When I talk about data observability, there are a few companies. I actually track 10 different companies. The big ones are Axel Data, Big I, and Monte Carlo. And they're all over the place. They all have gotten huge amount of funding, which is easy to do in this market, but they're creating a lot of new material. So the first thing first is understand where in the layer you want to observe. And by the way, each layer's observability tool does not interoperate with the other layer. So it's a separate set of tools. Like the Datadogs or New Relics do what they do the best. They have no clue how did that Java program perform in the pipeline. That's a different set of tools. So that's what adds to the confusion, because you are not going to get a single tool that will do observability for your entire infrastructure.
Well, but I mean, that takes me back to my earlier point when we opened the podcast. It feels at this point, and after what you just said, like observability is simply just an umbrella term.
No, it
I
is.
know folks are going to continue to use, APM and monitoring and logging, and data folks are going to use a different set of tools, and security folks probably something different. And each one of us has AI that factors in somehow. But it doesn't feel like it's a new thing, this cohesive, integrated, something that's going to give me insights maybe that I didn't know, or something that I should be doing that I haven't been doing. Am I missing something?
The tools aren't there yet, is my view from an INO perspective. I mean, it's just it's so early, right? And I live in this space. Sanjeev spends time here. I think Anna, you can't avoid it where you're at. It feels like because we live in it, we're in the 5th inning. We're not, right? We're still in batting practice. Right. And so right on time, I get a phone call. But we're still figuring out what this really looks like at this point. So is there a single cohesive answer? Nope. Not going to be one for a long time. And to Sanjeev's point, these tools do not work together. right? So this idea of I'm going to have a single pane of glass where I'll be able to look and know, oh, here's how all of my applications in my chosen cloud environment are functioning, right? I'm starting to see some anomalies. Let me dive into that. That's not where we are today. Where we're at for the company that I'm working for today, Cribble, we're trying to connect all of those data sources with all those different data destinations.
So how are you connecting? Is that agent-based API? Like how are they?
No, so we're basically a universal collector or a receiver. So we take whatever your existing deployed agents give us, and then we can manipulate that data however you see fit, whether it needs to be filtered out, you want to get rid of a bunch of noise, if you want to redact PII, if you want to enrich that data with by looking up to another database or something like that, and then send that on to a Splunk, a New Relic, a Datadog, an InfluxDB, even S3, and then replay that data later on. If you're like, all right, well, I sent 4% of my security data to my seam of choice or my multiple seams of choice, and later on you decide, oh, I need more data around that context around this given time frame. You can then send that data back into that platform. So where Cribble sits today is we're between the sources and destinations of all of that observability data, and giving you a lot more control over what happens to it. So without trying to get too vendor specific, that's effectively where we live today. And I think I just killed the entire conversation.
I was going to say, back to Elias. Eli really wants to ask about AI, so I think we should let him. But somebody is going to have to define AI, because this is one of those like nebulous terms like observability. But worse.
Yeah,
I'm
I'm kind of on the fence about this, because like AI is really good at like the repetitive things that happen a lot, where you can train the models for it. Fundamentally, I think observability is the opposite of that. Right? It's the thing that happens like once in a while, and you're like, I don't have a model that can detect that. And so that's where you'd start to say, this mythical observability environment, right, is where you'd start to say, all right, well, here's where we need a new model. We need to start training that data for it, or we need to start feeding our AI ops platform, whatever that is, to start detecting this new error pattern or performance degradation or even security issue that we think might be happening. So I think I would say that AI/ML, whatever you want to call it, is post observability, right? It's after the observability work, at least from an I&O perspective. That'd be my take on it.
So I agree that it would be post for sure. I mean, you probably have to lay a foundation first. What I'm trying to wrap my head around is when I'm listening to all of you talk, it's just the number of data, the amount of data would be incredibly difficult for any person or team to be able to get any kind of meaningful insight. So there's got to be something, whether it's AI, it's ML, or whatever else you want to call it, that is going through this data, crunching this data. And I don't think we can avoid having some kind of a model. Like they need to know what to look for, right? It can't just be tell me something, or can.
So that's the trick, right? I mean, first of all, it's called statistics. That's what it's called. But the reality is, like, crunching the data itself is not trivial, because when you say data, like, you could mean anything. There are hundreds of thousands of different kinds of logs that all look a little bit different. So you can't just like feed it through the machine and have the machine like divide them all or add them all together, whatever. It's not that simple, right? So there's a layer of interpretation there that's really complex, actually. And then beyond that, like back to the use case question, what are you looking for, right? Like you can't, like you said, you can't just say like, go forth AI, like find the patterns. I mean, sometimes you can, but the data has to be super clean and there has to be a lot of it, right? So if you know what bad looks like in the case of security, right? Or if you know what good looks like, you can make a thing that will detect the stuff that is like a little bit different, but still bad, right? That's what AI is really good at. Like when it's a little bit different, but it's still bad, like I find it very easily. The minute things get weird, like there's any ambiguity or there's just like a breadth of what bad might look like, and it's very difficult to codify that delta, like it's over. It's just false positives for days. Like, great, a different source of false positives. I'm so happy.
Also, the people that are dealing with all of this data are really good at dealing with all of this data, right? People build their careers around these tool stacks like Splunk, right? I mean, you can't ignore Splunk in this conversation, right? They ingest all kinds of data. They certainly charge you for it, but they provide an interface where you can search over all of this indexed data. And I work with these folks all the time. They really know what they're doing, right? If there's a performance degradation, they can start to hunt it down. If there's a security issue they need to do some threat intelligence on, they typically know what they're doing, and they're very adept. So from the outside looking in, it looks like a problem that you just cannot deal with. But if you're in it, I think you've developed the expertise. You understand a lot of the log formats, the hundreds or thousands of different log formats. Most of them are just different formats of the interpretation of the syslog standard, right? We see that all the time. Here's syslog. Okay, what does that mean? There's a dozen different versions. And so once you're in it, you know it. And you can't, while the expertise is expensive and hard to develop, it is no substitute. AI is no substitute for that kind of expertise, right? You still got to have the right people. You can't really throw money at this problem, right? You've got to have the right people, and they've got to have the right understanding of the data.
Yeah, AI. So Eli, I recorded a podcast recently. Actually, 1st of January, I released it. It's in which I talked to a couple of people, and we basically said AI is not artificial intelligence. It should always have been augmented intelligence. So to Nick's point, you use AI for repetitive, large volume of work and just going through this data very carefully. But then you need that human curation and the human intelligence on top to make sense of it. Because in case of log data and observability data, this is a lot of data. I was explaining to somebody this situation a while back where I was like, imagine you have a fire detector, the old school fire detector in your home, and the fire detector is monitoring for fire in your house. And for 5 years, it's saying, I'm okay. It's just sending that data out. Which is useless. I mean, it's not useless, but there's no change. And then one day, 5 years later, it starts making this screeching noise because the batteries are running low. So these observability tools have to be very smart and say, what data do we ingest? Why would we ingest for 5 years the same piece of data that is not changing, but we want to be able to compress it or do a delta and say, this data hasn't changed and now it has changed. And now we need to ingest it. So Nick, I'm not sure if you see this, but this is some of the things that these time series databases are very good at doing. Otherwise, they'd be just inundated with useless data.
And it's not just, do we get the data, right? It's how are we being charged for getting this data, right? Mm-hmm. It's punitive if you want to start storing everything.
Brutal.
So you have a conversation with these administrators and they're like, somebody wants to bring in DNS data. That's another terabyte a day that I've got to start ingesting. And most of that's garbage. Like most of it's going to be the global 2000 top domains, right? Which are not going to be any kind of indicator of compromise. But I don't have any control over how I get that data in. This is also where Cribble sits, but they don't have a lot of control over what they actually want to ingest and how they can pay for it, right? Everybody's budget is maxed out, right? Whether it's however you're paying for it. And so while people really want to bring in more and more data, they just don't have the money for it, right? They don't have the infrastructure. They don't have the licensing for it. It's really a challenge.
So Nick, DNS produces a terabyte of data. So that
depending on the size of the company you're talking about.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. Which reminded me that, with Teslas and electric vehicles becoming more popular, so a single Tesla produces 4 terabytes of data per day. Mm-hmm. And so with this, not just self-driving cars, but with 5G data, I don't think we'll even have a choice of how do we collect the data. We just have to collect it, right? I mean,
well, do we have to collect it though, Sanjeev? That's going to be my question. Do we collect
it? So the IDC
analyze it in real time?
Yeah.
See, this is that this reminds me that Malaysian Airlines MH some 470 or so the airline which disappeared. If we had collected that data, probably we would have a better idea as to where in the world is it hiding, because no one can find it, and it's been almost like 5 years now. since that plane just vanished from thin
They
air?
did collect the data. It was all collected on the flight data recorder. Go find. We just have to find the flight data recorder, and then we know exactly where the plane is.
Well, yeah, but
I'm poking
flight
fun at
data
you.
recorder I don't think it's
He's so
collected all the
serious.
data. I mean, I think that could have anyway. So I think should we or should we not collect the data is a loaded question, and I don't know if I have the capacity to say one way or the other.
Should
Well,
we?
to
Yes, we should
Eli's
collect
point,
it.
though,
Can I pay
I
for
mean,
it? No.
Of course.
Should we collect all data? Like that's my question. Like some
That's a
data
lot
we
of data,
can
man. Like,
analyze
and a
in
lot of
real
it is
time,
not
right?
very useful.
Yeah, a lot of it's not very useful. That's exactly it. But
So-
you don't know until you don't need it.
Exactly, but the problem is that it, like you said, because of usually the time and money constraints, you actually can't collect all of it. Like
Right.
you don't have to go to any futuristic use case. Like a Linux server is quite noisy, actually, right? So if you wanted to collect all data off a Linux server, like it could be terabytes of data a day itself. And for how many Linux servers are out there, like wow. So you have to make a decision. I mean, whether you're an end user or a vendor for that matter, you have to make a decision about which data you're going to discard.
Data classification.
Well, so roughly, yeah, because some of the analytics you have to do on the data you're going to discard has to happen like at the source, essentially, or really close to the source, because you can't ship it all to Splunk or wherever, because
Especially
that's
like
expensive.
something like Tesla, right? So my point though is sometimes we can collect data, but data that I've collected a month later is probably useless, right? I needed the data immediately. So
It
Depends on the
depends.
use case.
Depends.
Like
Depends on
if that's
Could
a
be
security
training
use
a model.
case, you might need that data for threat hunting or threat intelligence.
Some security incidents are not discovered until 180 days later. So
Right.
Yeah. Or you
The
may be
Log4j
training-
thing happened actually in 2014, I think was the first version. So, at what point did that start to get exploited? How far back do you really want to go? Now that data prior to that breach or whatever you've discovered, the value of that data was zero until
and then it wasn't.
and then it wasn't. Then it becomes really, really valuable. And so you can go to your business owners who are asking you to store more data, or your application owners are asking you to store more data, and you think, well, that's a really good idea. And then you go to your CFO and you're like, we have to pay another $1 million a month.
So Nick, you're telling me that my dad all of these years has been right. My dad does not throw away anything, dude. Like nothing.
Data holder. So Eli, this question that you're raising is actually an age-old question, because when storage devices were humongously expensive on premises and companies were building out these large data warehouses, the same question used to come up 20 years ago. And then the whole idea was that this is a lot of data, and it was not a lot of data from today's standard, but it's a lot of data. It's too expensive. Let's aggregate it and put it into a data warehouse. So this is how we operated, but then we lost the fine granularity, and we could do no new analysis on that data. We could only do analysis on whatever data remained, and it was of limited value. It performed the use case for which it was aggregated, but it couldn't perform any new use cases.
So let me ask one more question, and then I want to bring the conversation back to the folks that are listening to us, whether they're INO, whether they're data, whether they're security. If they want to get started, how do they get started? But let me ask you one more question. And Anna, I'm going to shoot this one at you. So I understand the value of storing data, but storing data for a long time in some use cases could also be a liability, no?
Sure. It depends.
I love it when you guys use
so
it depends.
I'm doing it on purpose. Totally.
Do it.
So I think I'm going to kind of answer it in a circuitous way to echo back to what Sanjeev was saying, and kind of what we talked about actually last time with, or a few times ago with multi-cloud and failures and so on. Like everything has a cost, right? Everything has a risk associated with it. So if it costs you a lot more money to store that data forever, or as you're pointing out, if there are risks associated with storing it forever and therefore costs associated with protecting it, it may be worth it not to, even if you're losing out on the opportunity to later analyze that data for some important insight, right? So you really have to think about what you imagine, or what you, I guess, calculate as a business, the opportunities and risks are of keeping or discarding any piece of data. And to be fair, that's a really difficult decision to make. it's unique to your business. You can't really make that decision on behalf of somebody else very easily.
And protecting data is not a factor of how long you keep it or how short. You just have to protect sensitive data anyway. So
I wasn't talking about protecting it. I was talking about sometimes keeping the data for a long period of time could be a liability as well. I mean, depending on the sector that you're in or the vertical that you're in. But let me ask each of you this next question. So if I'm an organization and there's a shortage of skills right now, there's even a shortage of people to hire. I mean, that's a crisis that we're having. If we wanted to train, how does someone get started with observability? Nick, I'm going to start with you. Tell me for an I&O person in particular, what do they get started? Is there a certification? Is there how do I get started on observability?
Well, there's certainly certifications in the traditional tooling, right? So what part of I&O are you, right? Are you kind of more logging administration? There's certainly a career track for that. You can talk about Splunk, talk about Elastic, those types of tools. A certification program is something my company is working on now. Cribble certified observability engineer. It kind of starts at the basics and goes through the products. So those are certainly options for you.
Those are vendor specific, though, right?
They're very much vendor specific.
Tells the whole story.
Well, I mean, you might take. Once again, it depends, right? You might take some classes on time series data analysis, right? If you're dealing with metrics, and metrics are an event that occur every X number of seconds, you might get every minute, here's the CPU load, right? Every minute, here's the CPU load, or whatever other kind of data you want to track. So metrics occur every fixed interval, and time series databases are really popular for that. And therefore, time series analysis is one area you can start to dig into. A lot of these tools do not use SQL, right? I think if you're putting all this log data into, a cloud data warehouse or anything like that, you need your head examined. So instead of using SQL, they use search, they use regular expressions. So knowing kind of that lingua franca of these tools can be really important if you want to start in kind of a more vendor agnostic kind of way. And then from there, I don't really know where else you would go, but those are certainly some of the areas I'd be looking at if I wanted to get started on, what does it look like to be an observability specialist, right? Does that mean knowing OpenTelemetry? Maybe it does. Maybe it means knowing a range of other things depending on what your company is doing. I see the occasional job posting for like an observability engineer, and the requirements are all over the map today. So it's still, like everything else, pretty early.
Okay. Sanjeev, let's go to you. So if a data person wants to get started on observability, is it the same path that Nick outlined? Is it a little bit different? Where would you advise them?
Yeah, I think for data observability, things are a little bit murkier than what Nick suggested, because observability data has been around for much longer. And as Anna reminded, data is finally catching up, which is true, even with DevOps and all of that data has been behind. So things are a bit harder because we do not have standards. You have to, so the steps that I would take if I were new in this space and the first step is, what is my pain point? Is my pain point sufficient enough for me to invest in an observability tool? Because I'm spending too much money, my data quality sucks, and my CFO is getting skewered by the regulators for wrong data, and so that's my pain point. So that's the first thing that will determine whether I should even look at observability product. The second thing is that, okay, now that I know I want it, what are my functional and non-functional requirements? So functional requirements are, is it a data quality issue? Is it a pipeline issue? Is it, some other issue that I need to observe? And that will then lead me to an evaluation criteria. Now, there is no evaluation criteria from the industry for data observability as yet. Of course, you can go to your selected vendor, but then you will get a skewed kind of a evaluation criteria. So there is an attempt that some organizations are doing to build an evaluation criteria which is vendor agnostic. So then you would take that and you would score and rank what capabilities are most important to you. Like, for example, are you getting data from relational databases or semi-structured JSON?
But you're describing an observability strategy. If I want to learn this,
Yes.
where do I go? Like, is there a course, a cert, someone? Like, how do I start? Like, how do I dip my toes in this?
So there is no certification for sure. There is a ton of material which is being produced by the vendors. So I would just go and listen. They have podcasts, they have documents, and then try to build your own point of view.
I would invite you to build a curriculum for someone that's trying to get started in the data space. Of here are the first, maybe the first 100 days in the life of someone that's trying to get in on data observability. I think that would be incredibly helpful.
Absolutely.
I just added something on your plate.
Yeah, thank you. And by the way, I have built my own evaluation criteria because I'm very passionate about this space. So for me to understand a company, I built my own, but it's just for my own consumption at this point. But yeah, good point.
Yeah. Anna, what about the security folks?
So I'm actually going to plug what Nick said about regular expressions, and I will plug SQL too, even though it's not as sexy, because you can do a lot with SQL, actually, be surprised, in both security and otherwise. So those methods of just probing data, so you can quickly answer questions about whatever data set you do have, are important. The second piece is to actually have that general data analytics mindset and skill set. So first of all, to think about what the data means in a I'm going to say correct way, right? Like, a lot of the reasons machine learning fails is people are trying to fit something to a data set that's too small, and they don't understand why that doesn't work. And you really should understand why that doesn't work before you try to create a machine learning model, right? So some of those basic skills you just have to pick up. I will go to something a little more high level, actually, and just say that if you kind of think about, in general, in your life, in your everyday life, not tech necessarily, how to measure things, right? Like, how do you know if you're having a good day? Like, how do you know if the weather is nice, right? And if you can come up with one metric for any one of those things, and then when you start asking yourself, like, how do I get one metric that tells me if my company is secure? You realize it's a really hard problem, actually. But if you could answer that question, you'd make a lot of CISOs and CEOs really, really happy. I'll also plug a book that's called How to Measure Anything by Doug Hubbard, which is a pretty good read in general about how we think about measuring things and how to actually come up with
We'll add the link
KPIs.
in the description for those that are interested. That way they can get access to it. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. Keep going.
No, that's all.
Awesome. We're coming towards, we're coming close to the end. So any final thoughts? From my perspective, it feels like we're onto something with observability, but I don't feel like 2022 is the year where observability is really going to go mainstream. It feels like it's a distributed function. It's a little bit all over the place with not enough structure. We kind of know what it is, but we can't put it together.
Yeah. So Eli, on that lines, I have to say one space that both Nick and I have collaborated on is data mesh. And same question about data mesh, how will data mesh evolve in 2022 and productionalization of data mesh. If data mesh takes off in this year, and we have this decentralized architecture, which is domain-driven and multiple self-service data infrastructures, I think data observability will become a key thing, because now you've got this decentralized and you need to get a single pane of glass to understand if you have security violations, quality issues, privacy issues. So that's what my thinking is, that we may actually see observability take off this year. But happy to hear.
So you think, Sanjeev, that this year we'll see some significant advancements in observability?
Absolutely. I have absolutely no doubts.
Nick, you share that?
I think we're going to see significant advancements in the amount of money that companies describing themselves as an observability company will raise.
They already have so much money.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like even companies like PagerDuty, right? Fundamentally a monitoring company are now describing themselves as an observability company. So there's a lot of momentum to kind of be with the cool kids, right? So I think that's what's going to happen. I do think there's going to be a lot of sharing of concepts of observability with targeted areas, right? I think security is going to be a big beneficiary this year. And I do think some I&O functions will also benefit. And then it's going to keep going. But I think it is still pretty early, in all honesty, right? There's people are still trying to figure out what this whole thing means. I give presentations on it all the time, and it's a lot of head scratching. And so identifying where that end result is going to be part of the challenge. But I think things will move a little bit this year, but much more momentum into 2023.
I will say that I think progress will continue in spite of all the confusion, the new terms and all the drama. I mean, there are a lot of really smart people trying to solve these really hard problems, right? And so those people just keep chipping away at the struggle. I do agree with Nick that there'll be some convergence of kind of applying concepts that have worked in security to observability or vice versa. I also think there's some process evolution that's kind of happening, which maybe is foreshadowing for a DevOps podcast. In that when you start asking some of these teams to think about each other's problems, they actually may come up with more effective ways to triage certain issues or to respond to certain issues using data they aren't used to seeing because they were so siloed before, right? So the security observability kind of marriage is what I'm hinting at, which I think will continue to evolve.
We should do another podcast in Q3.
I was gonna say I don't think this is the last time we talk about observability this year.
Yes.
I think there's
Some things never get old
that we can unpack for sure. Well, yeah. Speaking of doing more podcasts on observability or anything else for our listeners or viewers, first of all, if you enjoyed this conversation, we're gonna have links to all of the folks that are on the podcast's profile if you want to reach out to them for more information. But if there's a topic that you're interested in that maybe we haven't covered yet, leave a comment below. We'd love to get to it. Otherwise, on behalf of all of us, I want to thank you so much for watching or listening to this episode, and we will see you in the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.